Please? Richard Kirk.
Yeah.
And Alan Fish. Nice to meet you. I would like to ask you about Red Mecca, first of all, the latest release. A lot more listenable than previous efforts. Has there been any change in your methodologies or outlooks on...
Yeah, that was sort of something that was kind of split in England. A lot of people seem to think that, but there was like another faction who thought it wasn't. But I mean, I personally think it is, and sort of, I think maybe a lot more emphasis on rhythm has something to do with it, and the fact that it was recorded also on better equipment than the one previous. So maybe that helped sort of, I don't know, some way.
What sort of changes in rhythm do you perceive as more listenable?
Well, just the use of rhythm more.
Just the use of rhythm, whereas before you had more free form?
Yeah. And we've always used rhythm anyway, but
right.
I think using it more to try and sort of get more of maybe a dance element into the music.
Dance element. And how about you, Alan? Do you have any thoughts?
Really, I can't comment about
Okay. How do you use them? You've gotten a lot more aggressive in terms of selling yourself these days.
Yeah, I mean, we do sort of...
What's the motivation there?
It was sort of maybe a contradiction in what we were doing. We're trying to get across certain sort of feelings and certain ideas. The fact that it's pointless to do it unless you're going to try and reach as many people as possible. So we decided, even though we hate the whole thing about rock music and promotion, that the fact was that to compete against it, you've got to get in there and use it. Because everyone else does, and you just sort of at a disadvantage if you don't.
Well, do you fear becoming a part of this big commercial machine?
Well, maybe not a part of it, maybe just sort of a cancer hanging onto the side of it.
Hanging on to the side of it. What about in terms of results now that you've taken this course?
It's not really made that much difference, I don't think. I don't know, maybe in Britain when Red Mecca came out, it was sort of, it didn't sell a great deal more than the album before it, despite all the interviews and all the sort of promotion and whatever. But it did get very good reviews in the British music press. But I mean, even that sort of, I think it made people treat us with more respect than before.
Well, how about here in Japan? Do you feel you're reaching a larger audience with the good grace of Japan Records?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're doing a good job. I think they're doing a good job.
Forget that down. You regret what you've done before taking this sort of commercial direction?
Well, I'd hardly call it a commercial direction, but I think everything we've done before, it's all been a continuing process of education for ourselves, and sort of the experimentation just carries on,
right,
from record to record or whatever.
Right.
It's all progression.
Right.
And I think it's all been valid. You know, I wouldn't have wanted to done it any other way, really.
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about the live performance. It seems to feel the live is a lot more identifiable than the records. You have any comments on this? It's more accessible.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, the thing about the live shows is that we change them around all the time. So maybe some of them are more accessible, more sort of rhythm orientated than others. I think in some ways maybe it's more of a total thing, the live shows, because I mean you've got the films and the slides, and it's sort of, it's more it's not as one-dimensional as, say, the records. I think just the fact that it's a live event, that I think that a lot of the dynamics and a lot of the power in the music can be lost out sometimes on the record.
And how about you, Alan? What your feelings on live and as opposed to records?
Well, there's quite a dichotomy between the two. Whereas live you have the restrictions on say on a plain drum sound, which in the studio you choose not to use simply because it's restricted and it's all basically being done before. But in a live situation it's taken out of your control really, and you have to work within what's available. So then again, it's in a way it's a necessary compromise to actually use drums as an additional element of the music. It's a necessary compromise to settle for a rather straight sound and record.
What do you look to achieve in, say, recording as opposed to live performance?
Well, I've just been working with Richard and Mal recently on recorded material, and we seem to agree on the basic approach to everything. And Richard and Mal have a very strong idea of what they want on each track, what mood, what feel. So it's been very easy working with them. It's quite forceful as to how they want things to turn.
So they've got definite ideas as to what you should play it or how you should play it.
Yeah.
You should sort of follow the guidelines.
Yes.
At your concerts, what do you expect of the audiences? What do you demand of the audiences?
A reaction, whether it be a bad one or a good one, anything other than apathy. I'd rather people throw things at us and get annoyed rather than just sort of stand there and go.
How about actual responses thus far?
You mean in Japan?
I mean just in Britain and Japan.
Well, in Britain the audiences tend to be pretty cool anyway. They sort of, not many people dance to our music, say, in Britain, but in a lot of ways I think it's because there's a lot of preconditioned ideas that have come out through the music press and things that we're not a band that you're supposed to dance to. But I hope that a lot of that is going to change. But when we play abroad, it seems that people don't have so many preconceptions, and a lot of people do dance. Especially at the two shows we've done over here, the second shows have been, I think, are better in terms of audience response and in terms of the fact that we've fed off that response and produced better performance.
Well, the fact that you were playing in a disco may have something to do with a bit more of an animated response.
Yeah, probably quite true.
How about you, Alan? What do you look for in an audience? What do you want to do?
Basically what Richard said.
Pretty much.
It's a lot easier to play when you have a reaction coming back at you. If it is glasses being thrown at you, it makes you more angry and you play more aggressively. And it's just the same as if you're getting a good response. It's very difficult to play in a vacuum where you have total nil response.
Have you ever played in that sort of an atmosphere where just everybody's dead?
Personally, yes,
Is that right?
but not with Richard.
I don't know, I think when the first show in Osaka, the atmosphere was like something akin to a cemetery at first. It was like really, you could sort of just feel it, but it sort of gradually became sort of warmer as the show went on.
Well, that's what they say about Japanese audiences. They take a little while to sort of, cotton to the acts on stage, but by the end of the show, you usually got them in the palm of your hand. What do you feel about the Japanese audience this year?
I think they've been great. They seem to have enjoyed it.
Seem to have enjoyed it?
Yeah.
How do they compare with those back in Britain there? Not necessarily, you don't have to speak from your experience with Cabaret Voltaire, but I mean, how do you feel about the Japanese?
You tend to find an audience in Britain becomes more self-obsessed in a way.
What do you mean by self-obsessed?
Well, just the whole element of to go along and pose and be seen at certain venues, certain functions. And it's more a question of looking around to see who's looking at yourself rather than to actually go along to see the group. The whole thing of an event rather than someone to go and see a group.
Go see who perform. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I think that's pretty true. Pretty much true. Not sort of all the time, but especially in a place like London. Maybe not so much in sort of the more obscure towns, because I think sort of London audiences are sort of spoiled because they get so much. You know, I mean, sort of every band plays London, but no one plays sort of Rotherham or, you know, even Sheffield to a certain extent. A lot of the main sort of acts don't seem to, you know, come along there. But then again, we've got no need to talk because we don't play live very often.
It was so often said before that improvisation brings out sort of effectiveness in music, and it's one of the backbones of music. Do you feel this has anything to do with your group at all?
Yeah, I think I'd probably call what we do controlled improvisation, in so much as there are certain set frameworks, but there's a lot of room for manoeuvre. I mean, things change around all the time. I think improvisation is sort of very important in a lot of forms of music. I mean, I sort of see certain parallels between what we do and what jazz musicians do, even though the end result might not be the same.
Any comments on this, Alan?
I just basically agree with it. It's just strange that just before going out for a show, we wouldn't really know what we were going to play till say half an hour before when it was worked out, and also working out pieces during the sound check we played. So it's not a sort of rock and roll show in that respect where you play the same thing at every performance.
Right. You don't crank up the same things night after night.
We don't do encores. But we don't usually, but we didn't want to think in Japan just because it was sort of spur of the moment thing. I mean, like encores are usually contrite. People say, oh, so we'll do this for an encore. Right. I mean, I find that pretty, pretty sort of false.
It may seem like a silly question, but how much of your music do you think is improvisation and how much is sort of controlled or set, a fixed framework?
Well, there are certain rhythm tapes which we use, which obviously stay the same, but it's what we do around those tapes that changes. So, I mean, it's difficult to say. I'd say maybe it's a 50-50.
It's a 50-50. Let's see. Okay. Robert Fripp made a sort of a statement to the effect that if you were to say repeat the same phrase over and over, the same lick over and over, your outlook on music would change. And he's wondering what you think of this. It's kind of a vague question there, but
not quite sure what the question was sort of trying to.
I think maybe he recognizes the same thing in your music, perhaps. Sort of, maybe sort of a repetition, and the use of repetition to bring out maybe a change in the listener.
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm with it now. Yeah. I mean that is one thing that is pretty constant throughout a lot of our work, is that we do use repetition a lot.
Right.
It's always been sort of a fascination, right, that it affects maybe the subconscious or the conscious.
Right.
I mean, sort of groups like the Velvet Underground use repetition a hell of a lot.
Right.
I can name quite a few others. I think that it's been a tradition in sort of music ever since music began. You know, but it's a fact that repetitious phrases or rhythms, you know, sort of induce certain states of mind or whatever on the recipient.
I want to ask you about the chops as a musician. Do you demand any sort of a brilliant command of the instruments?
Well, speaking for myself and Mal, none of us are trained musicians in any way. What we do is what we've learnt for ourselves. I mean, we do sort of use certain common tunings in the equipment, but other than that, I mean, I think it's just like a self-developed style of playing.
Do you see it as sophisticated in comparison to any other to other bands?
Maybe it's sophisticated in its own way, but I mean, everything we do, we try to keep pretty simplistic. So we always think that simple things seem to be the most effective anyway.
Right. Well, so what about, say, when you hired Alan? What was your criteria? What made him a competent enough musician in your eyes?
I don't know.
Probably the fact that I'm not a competent musician.
Why?
It's as bad as we are.
Well, how do you rate?
Well, I only got interested in music in an active sense since '77 in England. Before then, I wasn't really interested in anything.
What got you interested in music just then?
Well, it was really exciting at the time.
I mean, the Pistols and all that stuff?
Yeah. Well, it was like a real upsurge in Britain.
Right.
Of interest, and my initial involvement was basically to put groups on in Sheffield, to actually find a venue and put groups on. So I was sort of helped Richard and Mal and Chris in that way. Initially, that was my first contact with them, was to actually.
Oh, I see. So you were just
put the concert on. So basically, because we sort of myself and a few other people really liked the music they were doing at the time, and a lot of venues at that time weren't interested in putting on groups that were stretching the boundaries a bit.
So at that time you were just sort of a member of the gang, and you weren't performing actually.
No.
So you were just kind of
just basically just getting involved in music in general, about the music that was coming through at that point. I know Richard and Molly have worked together a long time before then, but they hadn't become public until just into subsurgent interest. So that was how I first got involved in it. So I didn't start playing the drums till about 2.5 years ago. As far as that goes, and even then I've never ever taken lessons, so I've never become like a rock and roll drummer. Really taught basic time and stuff like that. It's just more, just get on the kit, just play what comes in.
Do you think you could earn your pay in another band other than Cabaret? Have you have gained that much confidence in your own playing now?
Well, the other group I play in as well,
they tend to think so.
Well, we're all in the same position. It's the way the music comes out rather than to analyse it and build it up that way. So it's more feeling on the top.
I see. Okay.
必要ないと。
必要はないっていうか、みんな自分のことで下手な。It is considered as being avant-garde here in Japan. What do you think of this label, and how do you define avant-garde music?
Well, I wouldn't really say sort of avant-garde. I'd say more experimental. I mean, I was sort of avant-garde music. It's more sort of covering people like Stockhausen, Cage, people of that sort of ilk who we've always sort of taken notice of. I mean, but I always thought, in a lot of ways, the ideas were more interesting than the actual end product.
Wait, maybe you could do that up for a little bit. How do you? What's the difference between experimental music and avant-garde?
Maybe there is no difference, really. I don't know.
Okay.
There's always been sort of a certain stigma or something attached to the word, you know.
Yeah, right.
Maybe sort of esoteric or sort of very sort of. What's the word I'm looking for?
Maybe a sort of obtuse.
Yeah.
まずそのね、
yeah.
Pardon me?
The literal translation of the word avant-garde, does it mean something like front line? I mean, maybe in that sense, yeah. Maybe we are. But it's just that like so much has been attached to that phrase that anything remotely concerned with that, you know, I sort of tend to shy away from.
No, avant-garde is rough.
That sort of that area of music or whatever, take it to street level, not just the sort of clique of intellectuals, something like that. Sort of get it out, make it more widespread.
それもっと具体的に言う such as Throbbing Gristle and Dome. What do you see as differences between you and them?
Well, I don't really know that much about Dome. I know those sort of people from Wire, but I don't think I've actually heard any of their stuff. But I know we did have a lot in common with Throbbing Gristle. I mean, we sort of started to work around the same time in a similar sort of field. But I think maybe they're in a lot of they were. I mean, they don't exist now, but they were sort of maybe a lot more radical in their approach to music than maybe we were in a lot of ways, or we are, should I say. But I mean, we're old friends anyway, and we've sort of been pretty close for quite a while. So sort of, I think we're kindred spirits, you could say.
Yeah.
It sounds like a good
it's about the political ideas in your music.
Well, basically, we like to keep music and politics separate. We'd never use Cabaret Voltaire as a political platform. In terms of politics, I think we're more journalists in so much as that we just reflect. I mean, I prefer to keep political opinions out of it altogether. I mean, it's something that you can't avoid, but I mean, we'd never use it as a sort of speaking point, you know, sort of say, oh, you know, we preach this kind of politics, like say the Clash or the Tom Robinson band used to do. I mean, I find that pretty distasteful that people should do that, because I don't think really that it's going to have the effect that they want.
What do you see reflected in your music then?
1982.
1982. Like what sort of concrete elements, specific elements can you list? Like,
Nothing specific, really.
No politics though.
Maybe just the politics of control, maybe just sort of the politics of the individual. We just like to look at things like sort of the way the man in the street is manipulated by media and by politicians, and maybe we just like to hint at certain things in our music, but it's down to the individual as to what he can get out of what we do. I mean, we have so many different interpretations. Sort of people write into us and say, "Oh, does this bit mean so and so?" And it's great that people do put so many different interpretations of what we do. That's one of the good points.
なるべく政治と音楽を分離する。In Japan, a lot of stuff is read into your music, such as like mysticism, politics, and etc., etc. What do you feel about this sort of journalism, or how do you feel about it?
I think it's probably just certain things interest us as people, you know, maybe subconsciously or maybe consciously, and I just think that is bound to come through in the music.
Well, how do you feel about this coverage of your music? This, I mean, like I say, with reading meanings into it that maybe aren't there.
I think our music's always been about sort of putting different ideas together to create new meanings anyway. And sort of certain things can be given totally new meanings when juxtaposed with other things taken out of context in the way that sort of surrealist painters do things. But I think it's good that people can read so much into the music.
Right.
At least it proves that we've succeeded in making people think, which is maybe one of the proper concerns.
That's a good point there. Another question about Red Mecca. If there's anything in it that you feel that you were trying to stress or trying to get across to people, what would you say that is?
I think possibly I think a lot of the influences that were coming through to us at the time of our music was like in the news. A lot of the time we were getting things about Iran and sort of Afghanistan, and I think just a general awareness to East and West and sort of different styles of living, how different that many of the Eastern sort of civilizations are to Western. Maybe just simply that people would sort of look further than their own culture. But
So,
other than that, I can't really say that there was any underlying sort of concept or anything. I mean, the reason it was called Red Mecca was because, I mean, we'd always had a fascination with the East and sort of Mecca and things like that, and sort of the sort of upsurge of maybe communist ideas and the way a lot of sort of things overlap between Eastern sort of ideals and ethics and communist ones, and it just seemed like pretty powerful imagery to put together. Sort of Red and Mecca, it was as if they were meant to go together in a lot of ways. I mean, sort of that's all I could say.
The Red Mecca seems a lot different than three mantras, or Eastern mantras. How have you changed the process of creating the record? I mean, what has been disposed of that you had been doing before?
It's difficult to say, but I mean, each record hopefully will have its own identity, its own different feel, its own different sound, and that's what makes it so interesting for us to work in this particular field, that we can keep trying out new ideas, keep experimenting with new sort of techniques, new equipment.
How did you change the process, actually producing the record?
I don't think it's changed. It's not changed that drastically, really. It's just, of course, the case of maybe the inputs change, the ideas change, the influences, the inspiration changes. I don't think, in a lot of ways, the way we put the things together, maybe it's a similar approach, but just the different. I mean, maybe just the sort of music we were listening to at the time, or just certain events, or just certain feelings between our songs.
So basically, it's not any conscious change saying, with this album we're going to do this and that. It's just you kind of get your thoughts together, go into the studio and cut an album. It's no real...
Well, I mean, the fact that we have our own studio means that we spend a lot of time experimenting with different things. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of sort of maybe pre-planning involved before we actually do commit anything to tape. Most of what we do is done in the first take to keep it spontaneous, and then maybe a little more time taken in the mixing, things like that, and the production side of it. And I think maybe in a lot of ways that's why Red Mecca was different, because we did think a lot more, take a lot more time in mixing that and sort of putting the way the tracks were sort of put together and linked and things like that. I think that is probably one of the things that made that different.
Do you think the not the last question, I'm sorry. A question on the way music is presented and, say, the differences in nationalities and, say, culture. He wants to ask about that. I'm going to ask specifically what he wants to say here. 具体的にどういうことを聞きたい? Well, he claims your music is very British. How effective do you see this music as being in Japan? I mean, because the Japanese people have a different culture and they're a different nationality altogether. Do you think this sort of thing could get through to them?
Well, I must disagree with him on the first point that I don't see our music as being British at all. I'd like to see it more international, and I think the fact that we're here must mean, for one thing, that it's going to get, it must have gotten through to people. Right. I mean, the fact that we've been sort of to Europe and sort of been appreciated over there. Right. So, I mean, I personally think because there's not so much emphasis on the vocals in the music in a lot of ways, because they're not sort of out front rock and roll type vocals. They're more another instrument in the way that we use treatments and effect on the vocals. I think that in a lot of ways would make the music more international, and so much as that you don't have to sort of listen to someone singing "My baby loves me" and so and so and so, sort of translate that and everything.
Do you see any sort of music as being like very British? You look at a band and say, "Wow, these guys really sound British," or "These guys really sound American."
It's difficult for me to say that. Maybe it's easier for other people to say that who are British. I mean, I couldn't sort of give a specific example offhand.
Well, the French are really fond of saying this music really presents, the French sensibilities to the maximum, blah blah blah. Yeah. You just can't quite come up with a band that to provoke the same sort of thought in you? Saying,
it's not something that I think about so much, to be quite honest. I mean, I never sort of put music and sort of nationality together that much, because I think it should be, sort of an international, worldwide thing.
Any comments on it? Particular. Before coming to Japan for the first time, what areas were you most interested in? I mean, in terms of anything, what?
You mean areas in a geographic?
No, not in the geographic sense. I mean, in the conceptual sense as well.
Well, I'm sort of, personally speaking, in fact, I think both of us are very much interested and inspired by film and literature.
Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I do, in a lot of ways, get a lot more out of sort of movies and sort of books.
Is that right? Well, what kind of?
Well, I like a lot of Buñuel's films for one thing, and a lot of Fellini's films. Sort of spend a lot of time tracking down sort of old black and white 1950s B movies and things like that. I'm a big fan of the William Burroughs school of writing. There's a few to be going on with.
What about in Japan? What had you thought about Japan before coming? What had interested you about Japan?
I think because Japan's sort of an old country and there's a lot of tradition and sort of it's amazed me really to see the two different styles of life. Like you see people walking around in traditional dress, and then you see sort of the ultra high tech sort of equipment, and that is sort of just an amazing concept in itself. I think that, I vaguely knew about that before I came, and I was sort of looking forward to just experiencing the whole thing. Tokyo's been an experience in itself for me.
You didn't know much about Japan before coming here?
Not a great deal. I'd heard sort of Japanese music and seen bits of sort of Japanese art and theatre, but I never really knew that much about it. Since I've been here, I've been more interested, and I'll sort of probably pursue the thing. I'd definitely like to take back some Japanese instruments to use when we get back. I'm sure that will be a tremendous Japanese influence in our music the next time we start to record.
Well, that should be. So you on your what you thought of Japan, your preconceptions, and how those compare with what you've actually seen since being here.
Well, as Richard said, the thing about the traditional and the more modern.
Right.
It's really interesting to see you have a certain number of people who react against this constant absorption of influences from outside and tend to withdraw within themselves and stick to the traditions. It was interesting in Kyoto yesterday to see the people visiting the temples who were there to actually worship, and they were fighting their way through all the tourists who were, crowding the streets, and these people sort of were really sort of. It was strange to see them literally barging their way through everyone to go to worship. That's very, in a way, that's sort of what's happening in the cities as well. I find this constant friction between the two elements. It's quite interesting to see that.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess that wraps things up. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.